All right, so ready to dive in. Today we're looking into the case of Joseph Naso.
Oh, interesting choice.
Yeah, it was requested, and I gotta say this one's pretty, well, chilling to say the least. Crazy Joe, they called him, or sometimes the double initial killer. You familiar with this one?
Vaguely, yeah. Wasn't he convicted of killing at least 4 women?
At least. That's what makes it so fascinating. There's a good chance there are others out there, possibly even linked to those unsolved alphabet murders years ago in Rochester, New York.
Right, right. I remember hearing about that. So what do we have to work with on this deep dive? Just news articles or...
Actually, we have some pretty fascinating stuff for this one. Court records, of course, news articles, yeah. But also, get this, excerpts from his diary.
Hold on, his actual diary, like handwritten?
Handwritten, creepy, right? Gives you a direct line into his thoughts.
Chilling is more like it, but also incredibly valuable as a source, right?
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning, before he was Crazy Joe and all that. Who was Joseph Naso? Just a regular guy.
Well, he was born in Rochester, actually. That's 1934. Did some time in the Air Force in the 50s, had an 18-year marriage that ended up in divorce. Seems he kept ties to the San Francisco Bay Area, though. That's where his ex-wife lived.
So seemingly pretty normal life, at least from the outside, but something obviously went wrong. Terribly wrong.
Yeah, no kidding. And those ties to the Bay Area, they become pretty important when you consider where his crimes took place. He moved around a lot after the divorce, took classes at different colleges in San Francisco, spent some time in the Mission District, then later on over in Piedmont in the 80s. Never seemed to stay put for long.
Constantly on the move. Do you think that was like intentional to avoid getting caught, maybe?
Hard to say for sure, but it certainly makes it harder to track someone, doesn't it? And he was already showing some signs of trouble even before all of that, petty crimes, even in his 70s, shoplifting, things like that. People who knew him started calling him Crazy Joe.
Wow. So even with those smaller crimes, nobody suspected he was capable of, well, murder.
I think that happens a lot, unfortunately. People miss the signs or just dismiss them. And in Naso's case, there's this other detail. It's almost more disturbing when you know about the murders. He worked as a freelance photographer.
Now that sends chills down my spine. Photography, requires a certain level of trust, getting close to people, knowing what we know now.
Yeah, it's pretty unsettling. Adds a whole other layer to it, doesn't it? A sense of manipulation, control.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about the victims. What can you tell us about them, and when did all of this start?
The first confirmed victim is Roxine Rakesh, just 18 years old. She was found dead near Fairfax, California, back in 1977. Cause of death: strangulation.
God, awful. And was this just the beginning of it all?
Sadly, yeah. Just a year later, in 78, they found the body of Carmen Lorraine Colon. She was 22, and they found her along that Carquinez Scenic Highway about 30 miles from where Roxine was found. It looked like he just dumped her body there, left it to decompose.
So it seems like he's escalating, becoming more brazen in his actions. And is this where we see that possible link to the alphabet murders you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, it is. Both Roxine and Carmen had double initials, which fits the pattern of those unsolved cases from Rochester. And if you recall, Naso was born there, lived there for a time. It's definitely a connection worth looking into.
A haunting coincidence, if nothing else. So who's next in this timeline of his?
Well, in 1981, they found an unidentified woman dead in Tiburon, California. This is where things get a bit strange. Naso was actually considered a suspect back then. He managed the residence where this woman lived, even took a photograph of her.
Wait, so he was a suspect at the time but not charged. How did he get away with it?
Somehow he did. It wasn't until like 30 years later that they could definitively link him to that Tiburon victim once they had more evidence from the other cases.
30 years, that's incredible. It seems like he was flying under the radar for a very long time.
He was good at it, blending in, seeming normal while hiding this incredibly dark side. It's frankly one of the most terrifying things about this entire case.
It does make you wonder how many other times he may have gotten away with something. So let's continue then. Who else was there?
Next, we have Sarah Dillon, though she was born Ramey Shapiro. She was a Bob Dylan groupie, last seen in '92. She was headed to a Dylan concert in San Francisco, I believe, ended up being killed in or near Nevada County.
A Bob Dylan groupie? That's a detail that definitely sticks with you. It adds another layer to this whole thing. So 2 more victims after that, right?
Right. In 1993, they found the body of 38-year-old Pamela Ruth Parsons in Yuba County. She was a waitress, and get this, Naso lived very close to the restaurant where she worked.
Oh, wow. So their paths cross. It seems like geography might have played a significant role in his victim selection.
Absolutely. And that pattern continues with the final victim, Tracy Lynn Tafoya, found dead in '94, also in Yuba County. She was drugged, raped, and strangled, and they found her body near the Marysville Cemetery.
6 confirmed victims, all women, all brutally murdered. It's just horrifying. But you said earlier that there might be more.
There's strong evidence to suggest that. In 1983, they found the body of a woman in Sonoma County. headless. They call her the Sonoma County Jane Doe because she's never been identified.
So how is she connected to Naso?
His rape diary, in it, he mentions a girl in Healdsburg, which is where they found the Jane Doe. This diary is, well, disturbing's an understatement. It's full of chilling details, lists 10 unnamed women, their locations, descriptions of stalking, assaults. There are even photos in there of victims posed with mannequin parts.
Wait a minute, he kept a diary detailing all of this.
He did. It's like a meticulously documented record of his crimes. And, it ended up being the key piece of evidence that led to his arrest.
No wonder they called him Crazy Joe. How on earth did they finally catch him after all these years, though?
Almost by accident, actually. Routine probation check in Nevada, 2010. When they searched his home, they found the diary, along with tons of photographs and other evidence. It was a gold mine for the investigators.
And the diary, all that other evidence, it was enough to convict?
Oh, absolutely. In 2013, a Marin County jury found him guilty of those 4 murders. Raugash, Colon, Parsons, and Tafoya. He was sentenced to death later that year.
This case, it's just heavy. Hard to believe someone could do all of this, document it all so carefully. It's like he wanted to be caught.
It's a thought, isn't it? Some psychologists actually believe that some serial killers do have this subconscious desire to get caught.
Makes you think. So what about the potential victims we talked about, like the Sonoma County Jane Doe and that possible connection to the Rochester Alphabet murders? Are they still investigating those?
They are. Those are still open questions. They did DNA testing, ruled him out for one of the Rochester victims, but there's always a chance he could be connected to others. And the Sonoma County Jane Doe, along with the other women in his diary, they're all still unidentified.
So even with a conviction and a death sentence, there are still so many unanswered questions, like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Exactly. Makes you wonder how many more victims are out there. What drove him to do all this, and was there something specific about these women that made them his targets?
So much to think about. We've covered a lot of ground here, from his early life and moving all over California to the victims and those disturbing details from his diary.
We've only just scratched the surface. Next time, we'll go even deeper, explore the psychology of a killer like Naso, take a closer look at that diary, and really try to unpack it all.
Back again, ready to, I guess, dive back into the dark world of Joseph Naso. Last time we walked through his background, the confirmed victims, and that incredibly disturbing diary the investigators found.
Yeah, that diary, it's really the key to understanding the scale of all of this. I mean, it wasn't just a list of names or locations. It was detailed, like a step-by-step, handwritten account of his crimes, all in his own words.
And there were photographs, too, right? Photos of his victims. You mentioned those.
Yeah, unfortunately. And not just ordinary photos. He would pose them in these incredibly disturbing ways, often using mannequin parts. It's a window, a really disturbing one, right into his mind.
All that detail, the planning, the documentation, it seems so calculated, almost like, I don't know, some kind of twisted artistic statement. Do you think that's possible? With the photographs, I mean.
It's not unheard of. You see that sometimes with serial killers. The act itself, the rituals surrounding it, it becomes almost like performance art for them. The documentation, the photographs, if they take trophies, it's all part of it.
So the diary, it wasn't just a record of his crimes. It was more like a macabre scrapbook, something he could look back on, relive it all.
Exactly. A way to hold on to that control even after the act itself was done. And for investigators, it was a gold mine of information. Not just the details about the victims, but it allowed them to see patterns emerge. His methods, the types of women he targeted, even the specific language he used.
Fascinating. What kind of patterns did they find? What did the language tell them about his mindset?
One thing that jumped out at researchers was how depersonalizing his language was. He rarely used names, usually referred to victims as body parts or objects. It's dehumanization, a way to detach himself from what he was doing.
It's almost like he was trying to, convince himself that these women weren't real people, that they were just characters in some twisted fantasy he had created.
You're right. That's a really interesting observation. It's something to see a lot with serial killers, this disconnect between fantasy and reality. They create these elaborate fantasies, often fueled by things like violent pornography or other disturbing material. And then they try to act them out in the real world.
So with Naso, the diary, do you think that was his way of bridging that gap between fantasy and reality, trying to make those fantasies more tangible? Writing them down, taking the photographs.
It's definitely possible. That act of documenting everything, it might have been a way for him to solidify those fantasies, make them feel more real. And it's worth noting that the diary itself, the act of writing in it, might have even been a source of sexual gratification for him.
Wow. It's pretty hard to wrap your head around that kind of thinking.
Absolutely. It's so far removed from what most people consider normal or healthy. That's exactly why it's so important to study these cases, to try and understand the psychology behind it all.
You mentioned earlier that the diary had graphic descriptions of sexual assaults. Did those descriptions give investigators any insights into his motivations or the kinds of women he was targeting?
Definitely. Researchers noticed this recurring theme of power and control. It seemed like he got pleasure from dominating his victims, forcing his will onto them, and there was often a sadistic element to it, this clear intention to inflict pain.
And what about the victims themselves? Did he have a type?
That's always an important question, right? It's one of the first things investigators try to figure out when profiling a serial killer. In Nasa's case, there were definitely some commonalities. Most of the victims were young, petite, often with long, dark hair. A lot of them seemed to be vulnerable in some way, maybe struggling financially, new to the area, or had a history of substance abuse.
So he preyed on women he saw as weak, as easy targets.
It appears so, and that ties right back into the need for control. He chose women he believed he could overpower, manipulate easily.
A true predator. We talked about the double initials thing earlier. Do you think that was, I don't know, a major factor in choosing his victims? Or more of a coincidence?
Honestly, that's one of the biggest mysteries of this case. It is a strange coincidence, isn't it? So many victims with double initials, especially with the potential connection to those alphabet murders back in Rochester.
Could he have been, I don't know, consciously trying to copy the alphabet murders? Or was it more subconscious?
It's tough to say definitively. Serial killers, they are often drawn to other high-profile cases. They may even subconsciously model their own crimes after words they've read about or seen in the media. So yeah, it's entirely possible that Naso was fascinated by those murders and it just manifested in his choices.
So even if he wasn't directly involved in those cases, the influence might still have been there.
Exactly. It really highlights how these seemingly unrelated cases can impact people like Naso. It shows how important it is to look at these cases holistically, to see connections and patterns that might not be obvious right away.
It's like putting together a giant, really morbid puzzle, isn't it?
Great analogy. And in this case, we're still missing some key pieces.
Let's talk a bit about the legal side of things. You mentioned he got the death penalty.
He did, convicted in 2013, sentenced to death. But there's a bit of a twist. California has a moratorium on executions right now, so even though he's technically on death row, it's unlikely he'll actually be executed anytime soon.
So he's just, what, stuck in limbo, legally speaking?
Exactly. And that brings up a whole other set of issues about capital punishment, the ethics, the legality of it all. But that's a discussion for another time, maybe.
For sure. So where does all this leave us? What are the biggest questions that are still unanswered?
Well, we still don't know for sure how many victims there were. The women in his diary are still unidentified. Investigators are still working, trying to connect him to other cases.
Do you think, is there any chance we'll ever have all the answers?
It's hard to say for certain, but, DNA technology is advancing all the time. Forensic investigation, too. There's always hope that new evidence will come to light. And maybe, just maybe, we can bring some closure to the families who are still waiting for answers.
It's a glimmer of hope, isn't it? In a very dark story. I have to ask, as someone who studies these cases, what is it about the Naso case that disturbs you the most?
For me, it's that contrast. His seemingly normal life on one hand, these horrific acts on the other. He was a father, a husband, a photographer. He interacted with people every day, yet he was able to keep this incredibly dark side hidden.
It's a chilling reminder that evil can hide anywhere. That's something that stays with you, even after the podcast is over. All right, so final part of our deep dive into the Joseph Naso case. It's been, well, a lot. Exploring the life and crimes of, honestly, a really complex and disturbing guy.
Yeah, no question about that. As we kind of wrap things up here, I think it's important to step back a bit, look past the horror of what he did, and consider the bigger picture.
That's a good point. What kind of impact did the Naso case have? I mean, on law enforcement, forensic science, even just on, how we think about criminal psychology?
Well, for one thing, Naso being able to avoid getting caught for so long, it really forced law enforcement to rethink how they investigate serial crimes. Think about it, he was active for decades, moving between counties, leaving victims all over. It really exposed a need for better communication, more collaboration, between different jurisdictions.
So almost like his crimes, they forced the system to improve, in a way.
Exactly. Weaknesses were brought to light, had to be addressed. His case really showed just how important things like centralized databases are, information sharing, having dedicated task forces that can track these kinds of offenders.
A wake-up call for law enforcement, for sure.
It was, and it led to some pretty big changes in how these investigations are handled today, like DNA technology. It became even more vital for linking cases, identifying suspects. Naso's case, along with others like it really pushed forensic science forward.
That makes a lot of sense. So from a law enforcement perspective, some valuable lessons were learned, even if it was because of this awful tragedy.
Definitely. And then there's the impact on forensic psychology. That diary of his, with all that meticulous detail about his crimes, it gave researchers this rare, albeit disturbing, look into the mind of a serial killer. They've been studying his writings, trying to understand his patterns, motivations, what triggered him, anything that could help us understand the psychology behind these horrific acts.
Like trying to decipher a code, finding clues hidden in his words.
Exactly. And, we may never fully understand what makes someone do these things, but every bit of information helps, right? Maybe we can start to recognize the warning signs, intervene before it's too late.
So even in his depravity, he kind of, I don't know, contributed to the field of criminal psychology. Strange to think about.
It is, but it shows how crucial it is to study these cases, no matter how disturbing they are. We can't just look away.
We've talked a lot about Naho, but it's important to remember, real people lost their lives, families were torn apart. What's being done to, I believe, to honor their memory, to find justice for them?
That's an incredibly important point, and it's not being forgotten. Law enforcement is still working, trying to identify the women in his diary, connect him to other unsolved cases. And there are organizations out there, dedicated to supporting the families of victims, helping them through the legal process, helping them find some kind of closure.
A long road, for sure, but at least there are people fighting for those who can't fight for themselves anymore.
That's right. It really speaks to, I don't know, the strength of the human spirit, that no matter what, even with this unimaginable loss, the pursuit of justice continues.
I've got to admit, this deep dive has been pretty heavy. Hard to hear all of this and not feel, I don't know, unsettled, even a little scared.
Understandable. It's normal to feel disturbed. I mean, the capacity for evil, it's out there, it's real. But remember, we're not powerless. Knowledge is power. Understanding the darkness helps us fight against it.
So what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from all of this? What's the biggest lesson from the Joseph Naso case?
For me, it's that evil can look like anyone. It hides in plain sight, blends into seemingly ordinary lives. We need to be aware, trust our gut feelings, never underestimate that potential for darkness. But there is hope. There are so many people out there dedicated to stopping these predators, to getting justice for victims, to making the world a safer place.
Powerful message. Even in the darkness, there's still light. People fighting for good, for justice. And with that, thank you so much for taking us through this, this incredibly complex and disturbing case. Really appreciate your expertise.
Thanks for having me. Glad I could offer some insight, shed some light on this dark part of human history.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Joseph Naso. If you're interested in true crime, forensic psychology, anything like that, keep learning, keep exploring. There's so much information out there. Just use it wisely.
Right. Knowledge is power. The more we understand, the better we can make the world. Safer, more worst.
Well said. Until next time, everyone, take care.